Would you electrocute an innocent person to death if someone in a lab coat told you to? Before you answer, consider this. In a Yale University laboratory, ordinary people just like you made that exact choice. They heard screams of agony, pleas to stop, and warnings about heart conditions. Yet they continued to administer what they believed were fatal electric shocks. Not because they were monsters, but because an authority figure simply said, "The experiment must continue." The most disturbing truth about human nature isn't that evil exists. It's that it slumbers within each of us, waiting to be awakened by the right command. And this isn't speculation or philosophy. It's been proven in one of the most shocking scientific experiments ever conducted. Before we continue, if you enjoy unraveling hidden truths and uncovering the forces that shape our world, make sure to click that subscribe button. Your support allows us to continue bringing you the insights that truly challenge how we think. Now let's go deeper. In the aftermath of World War II, as the world struggled to comprehend the Holocaust, a fundamental question haunted humanity. How could ordinary German citizens participate in such atrocities? The common explanation was simple and comforting: Germans were uniquely obedient to authority, or perhaps just inherently cruel. This explanation allowed the rest of the world to distance itself from such horrors. After all, we would never follow such orders, right? Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram wasn't convinced. Born to Jewish parents with roots in Eastern Europe, Milgram carried the weight of the Holocaust personally. But as a scientist, he suspected something far more universal and disturbing was at play. In 1961, as Adolf Eichmann stood trial in Jerusalem for his role in orchestrating the Holocaust, Milgram designed an experiment to test the limits of human obedience. The setup was deceptively simple. 2 participants would arrive at a laboratory, where they'd be told they were participating in a study about the effects of punishment on learning. One would be designated as the teacher, the other as the learner. The learner would be strapped to a chair in another room with electrodes attached to their body. The teacher would read word pairs to the learner and then test their memory. For each wrong answer, the teacher would administer an electric shock, increasing the voltage with each mistake. What the teacher didn't know was that the entire scenario was staged. The learner was actually an actor, receiving no shocks at all. The real experiment was to see how far the teacher would go simply because an authority figure, a man in a lab coat, instructed them to continue. The shock generator had 30 switches, starting at 15 volts labeled as slight shock, and increasing to 450 volts labeled XXX. As the voltage increased, the learner's responses evolved in a carefully choreographed manner. At 75 volts, the learner would grunt in pain. At 120 volts, he would complain verbally. At 150 volts, he would demand to be released from the experiment. At 270 volts, his response would become an agonized scream. At 300 volts, the learner would pound on the wall and stop responding altogether, suggesting they were unconscious or worse. If the teacher hesitated, the experimenter would calmly issue a series of verbal prods. "Please continue." The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Now, before Milgram conducted this experiment, he surveyed his colleagues and students about what they thought would happen. The consensus was clear. Almost no one would go all the way to the highest voltage. The prediction was that only about 1% of participants, those with sadistic tendencies, would administer the maximum shock. The reality shattered all expectations. 65% of participants continued to the maximum level of 450 volts. Let that sink in. Nearly 2/3 of ordinary Americans were willing to administer what they believed were potentially lethal electric shocks to an innocent person, simply because someone in a position of authority told them to do so. This wasn't limited to a specific demographic. Participants came from all walks of life: postal clerks, engineers, high school teachers, and laborers, men and women alike, young and old. This wasn't about individual cruelty or sadism. This was about something far more fundamental to human nature. What's most chilling is that the participants weren't apathetic to the learner's suffering. Many showed extreme stress. They sweated, trembled, stuttered, bit their lips, dug their fingernails into their flesh, and even had nervous laughing fits. Some experienced full-blown seizures. They begged to stop the experiment, yet when firmly told they must continue, most did exactly that. One participant, a middle-aged man who seemed particularly troubled by the experience, later explained, "I faithfully believed that the learner was experiencing pain, but I also believed that the experiment had some worthy purpose. The experimenter told me it did, and who was I to question him?" When interviewed after the experiment, many participants expressed profound discomfort and even trauma from their own actions. They struggled to reconcile their self-image as moral individuals with the reality of what they had just done. Some became defensive, insisting they knew the experiment wasn't real, despite all evidence to the contrary. Others shifted blame to the learner for getting answers wrong, and many displaced responsibility entirely onto the experimenter. "I was just following your instructions," they would say, echoing the notorious defense of Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. This experiment didn't just reveal something about human behavior, it exposed something about the very structure of modern society itself. We live in a world dominated by hierarchies and authority systems, from governments and militaries to corporations and religious institutions. We're trained from childhood to respect and follow authority. And while this creates order, it can also create the conditions for moral catastrophe. Consider how from our earliest days, we learn to obey parents, teachers, and other authority figures. Good children follow instructions. They don't question adults. This socialization is necessary for civilized society, but it also lays the groundwork for a dangerous psychological pattern, the habit of deferring moral judgment to those in positions of power. But here's where it gets more complex. Milgram conducted variations of his experiment, each revealing important insights into when people obey and when they resist. When the experimenter left the room and gave orders by telephone, compliance dropped dramatically to 20.5%. Physical presence matters. When two experimenters gave contradicting orders, participants became confused and typically refused to continue. Conflicting authority creates space for resistance. In another variation, participants merely had to assist someone else who was administering the shocks. Under these conditions, compliance rose to a staggering 92.5%. The ability to share responsibility, or more accurately, to dilute it, made participants even more willing to participate in harm. This phenomenon helps explain how bureaucracies can commit atrocities that no single individual would consider acceptable. When everyone is responsible for a small part, no one feels responsible for the whole. Perhaps most significantly, when participants observed others refusing to continue, their own resistance skyrocketed. Only 10% went to maximum voltage when they saw peers refusing to obey. This reveals something profound and hopeful. While we're susceptible to harmful authority, we're equally influenced by moral examples of resistance. A single person willing to say no can break the spell for others. When the experiment was moved from Yale to a less prestigious location, a rundown office in Bridgeport, compliance dropped to 47.5%. This suggests that the perceived legitimacy of the authority matters greatly. We don't simply obey power. We obey power we believe has the right to command us. This is where we confront the unsettling paradox at the heart of human nature. The same psychological mechanisms that make society possible, our tendency to cooperate, to follow social norms, to respect hierarchy, can also make us complicit in terrible acts. The line between civic virtue and blind obedience is razor-thin. Consider this. How different are Milgram's participants from soldiers following orders? From corporate employees enforcing harmful policies? From citizens supporting government actions they know are wrong? The uncomfortable truth is that the capacity for evil doesn't require monsters. It just requires ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances, under the direction of perceived legitimate authority. What makes this even more disturbing is how easily authority is established. In follow-up studies, researchers found that something as simple as a uniform, a title, or official-looking documentation can create the perception of legitimate authority. We respond to the symbols of authority almost as readily as to authority itself. The psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who later conducted the infamous Stanford prison experiment, called this the power of the situation. His work complemented Milgram's by showing how readily ordinary people adopt roles that their environment suggests. whether as obedient subjects or as cruel authorities. Together, these studies paint a picture of human nature that is far more malleable and context-dependent than we like to believe. Let's go deeper into what happens psychologically when we obey authority against our better judgment. Milgram identified a state he called the agentic shift, where individuals no longer see themselves as responsible for their actions. Instead, they view themselves merely as agents of an external authority. "I was just following orders" isn't just an excuse. It reflects a genuine psychological transfer of responsibility. This agentic shift explains how moral people can commit immoral acts without experiencing themselves as immoral. They've temporarily suspended their own ethical framework and replaced it with a simpler rubric. Obedience equals good, disobedience equals bad. Within this mindset, the most virtuous action is perfect obedience. But there's another layer to consider. When we enter hierarchical situations, we don't just take orders, we actively try to please those above us. Participants in Milgram's experiments weren't simply obeying. Many were trying to be good subjects by giving the experimenter what they thought he wanted. This eagerness to please authority figures can be even more dangerous than mere obedience. The cognitive dissonance that participants experienced, the mental conflict between their self-image as decent people and their actions inflicting apparent harm, created immense psychological pressure. To resolve this tension, many participants began to rationalize their behavior, creating justifications for continuing rather than simply stopping the experiment. Some began to blame the learner, suggesting they deserved punishment for their incorrect answers. Others convinced themselves the shocks weren't really as painful as the learner's reaction suggested, and many retreated into proceduralism, focusing obsessively on the technical aspects of the experiment rather than its moral implications. These rationalization mechanisms aren't unique to Milgram's laboratory. They operate whenever we find ourselves complicit in systems that cause harm. The corporate executive who justifies laying off thousands of workers by focusing on shareholder value. The soldier who convinces himself that civilians in a war zone must be guilty by association. The citizen who supports harmful policies by telling themselves it's necessary for security or prosperity. The psychological mechanisms are identical. This brings us to a profound question. If ordinary people can so easily become complicit in harm, what protects society from descending into systematic cruelty? The answer lies in understanding the conditions that enable resistance. Studies following Milgram's work identified key factors that help people resist harmful authority. Critical thinking and education about authority dynamics significantly increased resistance. Exposure to historical examples of both obedience and resistance helps people recognize dangerous situations. Strong personal values that prioritize individual moral responsibility over group cohesion provide internal barriers against complicity. And perhaps most importantly, social support for disobedience is crucial. It's much easier to say no when you're not the first or only one doing so. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who covered Adolf Eichmann's trial for The New Yorker, introduced the concept of the banality of evil to describe how ordinary people could participate in extraordinary atrocities. Her insights paralleled Milgram's findings. Evil often doesn't appear as monstrous villains or sadistic psychopaths. Instead, it manifests in the mundane actions of ordinary people who have surrendered their moral judgment to authority, who have become so embedded in bureaucratic systems that they lose sight of the human consequences of their actions. Eichmann himself exemplified this banality. Far from being a frothing ideologue, he presented as a meticulous bureaucrat who saw his role in the Holocaust primarily as a logistical challenge. He didn't hate Jews particularly. He was simply following orders efficiently. His defense, that he was just doing his job, echoes disturbingly with the justifications offered by Milgram's participants. The parallels between laboratory behavior and historical atrocities suggest something deeply unsettling. The psychological distance between ordinary compliance and complicity and evil might be much smaller than we'd like to believe. So if power structures can so easily corrupt ordinary people, does this mean that morality and ethical behavior are doomed to fail? Not necessarily. But to understand why, we need to challenge one of the greatest illusions of modern society, the belief that our moral character is fixed and unchangeable. Here's the final twist that reframes everything we've discussed. What Milgram's experiment truly reveals isn't just how easy it is to obey harmful orders. It's that our moral behavior is dramatically influenced by situation and context. We're not as consistent as we believe. The person who helps a stranger one moment might ignore suffering the next, depending on how the situation is structured. This situational influence on ethics means that creating moral societies isn't just about having good people. It's about designing systems that bring out the best in imperfect humans. It means creating accountability structures where no authority goes unchecked. It means fostering cultures where questioning authority is not just permitted but valued. And it means designing institutions where responsibility remains with the individual, even within hierarchies. Modern corporations and militaries have begun incorporating these lessons into their training. Ethics courses now often include discussions of Milgram's work, teaching people to recognize when they're experiencing an agentic shift and providing strategies for maintaining moral awareness in hierarchical situations. Whistleblower protections acknowledge the difficulty of standing alone against authority and attempt to reduce the social costs of ethical resistance. One fascinating development has been the integration of Milgram's findings into leadership theory. The most effective leaders don't demand blind obedience. They cultivate environments where followers feel empowered to question orders when necessary. This approach not only prevents ethical disasters but often leads to better decision-making overall, as multiple perspectives are considered rather than a single authority's vision. The most chilling aspect of Milgram's experiment isn't that people obeyed. It's how easily they could have refused, yet didn't. The verbal prods used by the experimenter had no real power. At any moment, participants could have simply stood up and walked away. There were no threats, no coercion beyond mere words. The authority was entirely constructed, yet it felt absolutely real. This reveals perhaps the most liberating truth of all. The power of harmful authority exists largely because we believe it exists. Our obedience isn't taken, it's given. And what is given can be withheld. What about the 35% who did refuse? Their experiences are equally instructive. Many began like those who continued, following orders despite visible discomfort. But at some point, something crystallized within them. Some cited religious values. This is not what God would want. Others appealed to personal ethics. I can't continue to hurt this man. Some simply recognized their own autonomy. You can keep telling me to go on, but I choose not to. These resistors often experience the same pressure, the same discomfort, and the same urge to please the experimenter as those who continued. The difference wasn't that they felt less pressure. It's that they found resources within themselves or their belief systems to withstand that pressure. Since Milgram's original experiments, our understanding of obedience has evolved. Modern research suggests that people don't blindly obey. They identify with authority figures and causes. This means that resistance begins not just with courage to disobey, but with the critical examination of which authorities deserve our identification in the first place. The Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted by Philip Zimbardo a decade after Milgram's work, revealed another dimension of the problem. Not only do ordinary people follow harmful orders, they can also become harmful authorities when placed in positions of power. The college students randomly assigned to be guards in Zimbardo's simulated prison quickly began abusing those assigned as prisoners, without explicit instructions to do so. This suggests that the problem isn't just our tendency to obey authority, but also how authority itself can corrupt those who wield it. Together, these findings paint a complex picture of human social behavior. We are remarkably susceptible to social influence, responsive to hierarchies, and quick to adopt the roles our environment suggests for us. These tendencies served evolutionary purposes in our tribal past, helping create cohesive groups that could survive in hostile environments. But in modern societies with vast power differentials and complex technologies, these same tendencies can enable harm at unprecedented scales. What does this mean for us today, as we navigate an increasingly complex world of nested authorities and competing value systems? Milgram's work offers a sobering reminder. Our moral intuitions may not be reliable guides in unfamiliar situations. The feeling that we are doing right by following orders may be deeply misleading. True ethical behavior requires vigilance, critical thinking, and the courage to question authority, even when, perhaps especially when, obedience feels most natural. As we face a world of increasing complexity and interconnection, the lessons of Milgram's experiment become more relevant, not less. From climate change to artificial intelligence, from economic inequality to surveillance states, the great challenges of our time will test our relationship with authority. Will we question when necessary? Will we disobey when ethical? Or will we continue administering shocks long after we should have stopped? The study of obedience reveals something profound about the human condition. We are neither inherently good nor inherently evil. Instead, we are fundamentally responsive to our environment, to social cues, and to authority structures. This makes us vulnerable to manipulation, but it also means we can create conditions that bring out our better nature. In the decades since Milgram published his findings, ethical standards for psychological research have evolved significantly, largely in response to his work. Modern researchers must obtain informed consent, avoid deception where possible, and minimize psychological distress. Ironically, Milgram's experiment about the ethics of obedience raised profound ethical questions about the experiment itself. Would you design an experiment that leaves participants believing they may have killed someone, even temporarily? Is knowledge worth that cost? These questions have no easy answers, but they point to a deeper truth. Ethics is rarely about clear black and white choices. It involves navigating complex trade-offs, weighing competing values, and making judgments in conditions of uncertainty. This complexity is precisely why simple deference to authority is so dangerous. It short-circuits the messy but essential process of ethical deliberation. Perhaps the final lesson of Milgram's work isn't about obedience at all. It's about awareness. By understanding the forces that shape our behavior, we gain the power to resist them. Knowledge of our psychological vulnerabilities becomes a form of immunity against exploitation. So the next time you find yourself deferring to authority, whether a boss, a government, or even a social media influencer, ask yourself, am I making this choice consciously? Or am I experiencing an agentic shift that allows me to act without feeling responsible for my actions? Am I following legitimate authority serving worthy ends? Or am I surrendering my moral agency to a system that doesn't deserve it? The answers to these questions won't always be clear, and that uncertainty, that space for reflection and judgment, is precisely what makes us moral beings rather than mere instruments of authority. If this exploration of authority and human nature has made you think, challenged your assumptions, and sparked a deeper curiosity about psychology and ethics, then make sure to subscribe. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this video with those who need to hear this truth. Because in a world where blind obedience remains a constant threat, awareness may be our most powerful form of resistance.